Hello, everyone. My name is Muriel Lanford. I work with Ransom Life of Texas. We're a San Antonio nonprofit that serves minors and young adults who are victims and survivors of sex trafficking and other sexual exploitation. I'm going to talk about human trafficking, what it is and isn't, so we're going to address some common misconceptions as well. As healthcare providers, we're one of the few professions who are likely to interact with trafficking victims while they are still being trafficked. I'll talk about how this happens a little later right now. I'd like you to see some of the faces of human trafficking.
Human trafficking is slavery.
And it happens all over America.
Any child, any woman, any man could potentially become a victim of human trafficking.
I am a victim of labor trafficking.
I was a victim of child sex trafficking, but now I own my body.
Human trafficking is any kind of forced labor.
It can happen to anybody.
I am a mother.
I am an author.
I am a son.
I'm an advocate.
I am an educator.
I'm a sister.
I am a brother.
I'm so much more than what happened to me.
I am strong.
I am brave.
I am outspoken.
I am compassionate.
I am a survivor.
I'm a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor.
I am a survivor of human trafficking.
This video shows you how anyone can be a victim of human trafficking. Today, we're going to cover the major categories of human trafficking. We're going to differentiate it both from smuggling and consensual commercial sex. I'll explain the scope of the problem, including the challenges with assessing that, and help you recognize various risk factors and red flags. Lastly, we'll discuss some appropriate patient-centered interventions. These are some of the key terms I'm going to cover today, and understanding what they mean in the context of human trafficking really is critical to interacting with victims and survivors. In fact, regarding those last two terms, note that an individual can go back and forth between the role of victim and survivor, sometimes multiple times. That is not at all uncommon. Before we go further, let's define what we're talking about. What is human trafficking? The federal law that defines human trafficking is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA. The TVPA defines a trafficking victim as anyone induced to perform labor or commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. That means force, fraud, or coercion must be proven in a court of law, except when a minor is involved in commercial sex. If a minor is involved in commercial sex, it doesn't matter if the minor is doing it willingly or if a buyer says, oh, I didn't know they were underage. Federal law says a minor cannot legally consent to commercial sex. A minor then involved in any type of commercial sex is, by federal law, automatically a human trafficking victim. Now, other than that exception I just mentioned, trafficking has to involve force, fraud, or coercion. There are certainly other types of exploitation, but one of those three factors must be present in order for it to be trafficking. Physical force is not typically the initial means of entry into human trafficking, even though that's a common depiction in the media. What is much more common is fraud. Something is promised, it doesn't happen, and then the trafficker will typically maintain compliance through some type of coercion. This may be threats of violence to the victim or their family. I'm going to harm your parents, or I'm going to do the same thing to your little brother or your little sister if you don't comply. Sometimes all it takes is psychological manipulation. The trafficker will often just withhold basic needs. Food and sleep are frequently used as coercive techniques to retain control. Debt bondage is where a victim's debt always exceeds their pay and they're just never able to escape the never-ending debt cycle. Remember, for minors, though, involved in commercial sex, force, fraud, and coercion, that is not required and does not have to be proven in a court of law. In the state of Texas, there are 4 different types of human trafficking recognized. There's adult and minor labor trafficking and adult and minor sex trafficking. I'll delve more into the distinctions between labor and sex trafficking shortly. It is important not to confuse human trafficking with human smuggling. The news media is actually better than it used to be about distinguishing between the two. I think most of you recall the horrific case from San Antonio in June of 22 because it made national news. A long-haul truck was discovered abandoned in the middle of summer in South Texas, packed with individuals who'd been brought across the border illegally, without adequate food, water, or ventilation. 53 human beings died in that event. A lot of media sources got it right this time by identifying it as a horrific smuggling case. This was an improvement from a very similar case that we had in 17 when several media outlets referred to it as a horrific case of human trafficking. We were like, no, no, it's not. It was another horrific case of human smuggling. So what's the difference? Whether we're talking about weapons or drugs or people, smuggling is illegally transporting something across a border, whereas trafficking is illegally buying or selling something. In this case, we're talking about human beings or human services. To be clear, you do not have to be transported anywhere in order to be trafficked. Some victims are trafficked in their own home by caregivers, relatives, or even parents. In fact, we are seeing increasing evidence of the prevalence of familial human trafficking. And this is why trafficking is often referred to as a modern day version of slavery. But is it that big of a problem, or is it just kind of the issue of the day? Well, that's a fair question, but as clinicians, when we examine a problem, we want to look at data. Well, therein lies the problem with human trafficking: data. A number of sources have tried to estimate the scope of the problem in the US, but organizations differ, methodologies differ, statistics are all over the map. If you are searching for Texas statistics, this is a study that you will likely come across. This was considered a seminal piece of work when it was published in 2017 by the School of Social Work out of UT Austin. Is this data accurate today? Again, that's the problem with human trafficking. The bottom line is we just don't know what we don't know. I want you to note on this slide, though, the difference in estimates for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Sex trafficking is 79,000 at the top, estimated, 234,000 in blue, estimated victims of labor trafficking. I'm going to come back to that in just a bit. Additional challenges with data include the lack of training and identification for all involved in the process, and that includes healthcare providers, law enforcement, social service practitioners. We're certainly making a dent, but there is much more work to do. When the justice system is involved, identification of trafficking victims often gets pushed to later stages of those criminal justice proceedings. Oftentimes, they're not even identified until much later. Just the nature of trafficking itself can complicate identification. And then many victims just don't even realize that they're being trafficked or even that they are victims. Therefore, the most significant limitation with human trafficking is that we only have data on cases that have been reported or somehow otherwise discovered. Well, how does human trafficking happen? Trafficking occurs because of vulnerability. Well, what causes vulnerability? Many victims, but not all, start with adverse childhood experiences, and hopefully more clinicians are learning and becoming more familiar with ACEs. An ACE is an adverse childhood experience, such as someone who is homeless, food insecure, who lives in poverty, who lives with a parent or a caregiver who's abusive or an addict, or maybe there's an incarcerated family member that was a provider, or perhaps there's significant trauma or abuse in the home, or perhaps significant mental health issues in the home. If you are not familiar with ACEs, I really encourage you to explore that research, because ACEs have been shown to independently have a profound influence on health outcomes, regardless of other variables. ACEs themselves certainly can cause vulnerabilities. However, you don't have to have any significant ACEs to be vulnerable. With labor trafficking, the vulnerability is usually due to a physical need. They need a job, they need to provide for their family, or they're seeking safety. Traffickers will make promises to meet those needs. With sex trafficking, in a way, we're all vulnerable when we're young. Think back to when you were a teenager. Virtually everyone at that age is looking for love and affection, acceptance, romance, adventure. I was the adventure girl. Sex trafficking vulnerabilities then may include obvious ACEs. Perhaps they're a runaway or trying to escape abuse at home. But it also may be something just as simple as a teenager who posts online that they just had a fight with their parent. Well, if they posted it online, they are now vulnerable. Traffickers also will manipulate just basic human needs and desires to create vulnerabilities, and this can easily happen in the absence of any ACEs. But in all cases, accessibility is what is key. Whether we're talking about labor or sex trafficking, if someone is accessible, they're a potential victim, and if they're online, they're accessible. More technology shortly. Other vulnerabilities may include those with disabilities or mental health issues, anyone with challenging or high-risk relationships. The LGBTQ and indigenous communities are particularly susceptible. Even with mass disasters, traffickers have learned how to take advantage of all of these. Let's talk a little about the difference between labor and sex trafficking. Remember, with labor trafficking, it has to involve force, fraud, or coercion. What does it look like in the state of Texas? These are some of the types of forced labor that we know have been prevalent in Texas over the past few years. Domestic work, or sometimes called domestic servitude, which can be very difficult to detect because it occurs in a private residence. Restaurants and food services are common places for forced labor. Housekeeping and cleaning services. And this may be at a private business or a motel, but oftentimes they're sent to different job sites, being forced to work in that industry. Agriculture is also big business in the state of Texas, another place where forced labor commonly happens, as well as construction, landscaping, and groundskeeping. I want to address a common misconception that I used to believe, and I still hear other people say this. Well, of course, trafficking is a big problem in Texas. We're close to the border. Not really. Foreign-born individuals, especially if they've recently arrived here in the U.S., they're at a higher risk for labor trafficking, but they can still be from Africa or Asia or Eastern Europe just as easily as they can south of the border. They may answer an ad or accept a job offer and make their way here legally. In fact, studies have shown that a majority of forced labor victims do enter our country legally, but a common form of control by traffickers is confiscating passports and visas, which they'll often claim is for safekeeping, and the victim never gets it back. Well, then the victim fears deportation, even if they are here legally. This couple was convicted in April of 24 of labor trafficking. She was a psychiatric nurse practitioner. He was a double-boarded psychiatrist, an MD, and also chairman of the board of trustees at the behavioral health center where he worked. They lured two individuals into the country legally with a promise of education in America. But when they arrived here, the couple confiscated their passport and their visa respectively, and the abuse began. They were forced to work in the couple's home. Now, the NP, the nurse practitioner, was the primary abuser, both physically and psychologically, through isolation, degradation, constant surveillance, and threats not only to the victims, but to their children as well. However, the physician husband knew all about the abuse, and he was happy to benefit from their labor and services. And again, they were convicted of forced labor. No, you can't legally traffic your own children. This mother of four was forcing her children, ages 11 to 16, to work for her friend's cleaning service against their will. And the kids were threatened with physical harm if they didn't comply, and they were found by law enforcement living in deplorable conditions. Both women have been charged with labor trafficking. This was an interesting case from 19. This was a married couple indicted in Burnett County in Texas, and they were running a supposed Christian nonprofit for troubled boys. Not only were they mistreating the boys, they were using them as free labor to make money for their lawn and moving business. Why do I find this case interesting? Burnett County, where this occurred, Bertram itself in Burnett County, is a town of about 1,500. Now, it's less than an hour drive from Austin, so it's not part of a big metro area. It's not even a suburban community. And my point is this: human trafficking not only can, but it does occur everywhere. It occurs in small towns just as it does in big cities, and it happens in wealthy neighborhoods as well as poor communities. Before we look at sex trafficking in the state of Texas, I want to address that disparity that I mentioned that we often see between sex and labor trafficking. Many sources, including that UT study, consider labor trafficking to be the bigger problem, often by a lot. Why don't we hear much about it? Why does sex trafficking get all the attention? Well, there are a number of reasons. First, when you conjure up images of sex trafficking of children in your mind, it's just horrific. It's hard to even get your head around. So it gets more compassion, more media attention, and generally more resources. Labor trafficking tends to be more insidious because victims are less likely to outcry or be discovered for several reasons. First, if they're foreign-born, they're in a country where they may or may not have a good command of the language. Maybe they have little trust in law enforcement due to circumstances back in their home country. Maybe they're not familiar with our justice system and know that we have laws that even protect non-citizens from this type of abuse. Or if being trafficked is their only source of income, they may fear losing that despite the circumstances. So victims just may not know that they have any recourse, or they may fear deportation even more, especially if the trafficker has confiscated their visa or passport. And for all these reasons, prosecution of these cases can be more difficult. Sadly, labor trafficking also sometimes gets mixed up with immigration policies and discussion and politics, and it just makes it less popular to talk about. You can, though, have labor and sex trafficking concurrently in the same setting. We do sometimes see that. Looking at current trends in Texas over the past few years, these are some of the examples of sex trafficking that we've seen commonly in the state. Escort services and personal sexual servitude, hotel, motel, residence-based commercial sex, strip club-based sexually related activity, illicit massage and spa businesses, and pornography. I want to point out one thing about pornography. Since 2021, pornography has been the second most common reason for calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline because porn is a common avenue for sex trafficking. I used to see porn as pretty much a victimless crime, but now we know that online porn is often forced. It's not voluntary. And it's not going to appear forced. You're not going to be able to tell by looking at it. When viewing porn, just be aware that your click of the mouse may be supporting human trafficking because those clicks, that's money for a trafficker. Speaking of porn, this is a term that needs to go away. There is no such thing as child pornography. It is child sexual abuse material, and that is the term that is now used. And this includes AI-generated material or deepfakes. And sadly, it's getting more difficult to distinguish these from the real thing. If you see the abbreviation CSAM, that's what it means. The phrase child pornography may still be found in some existing laws, but this is now the preferred term, and we hope to see a transition to CSAM, which is what it is. I want to also clarify the distinction between sex trafficking and consensual commercial sex or prostitution. Basically, one is voluntary and the other is not. However, that is an oversimplification. It is not always that clear cut. Are they controlling their own money and their own schedule with no force, no fraud, no coercion? If so, then it's probably not human trafficking. Boys and young men engaging in what we call survival sex are more likely than females to operate independently. But if there is a pimp involved, often that pimp is actually a trafficker. Is the pimp controlling the money? Are they using physical abuse or threats to exert control? Are any of the sex workers not allowed to eat or sleep until they make a certain quota? Are any of the minors? That's all trafficking. An interesting survey in 2008 surveyed more than 800 prostitutes, and the vast majority, nearly 90%, said that they were in that life only because they felt they had no other option to survive. Prostitution is usually not as glamorous as entertainment media sometimes make it out to be. What's my point here? We sometimes see young people who start out making sexually explicit content online to make some extra cash for whatever reason, thinking they're not at risk because it's online, and they're not aware very frequently that ends with exploitation. This was an interesting study out of San Diego County. Researchers in that county went back and pulled 2 years worth of all their prostitution cases. And when they re-examined them, they found that fully half those cases actually met the federal criteria for human trafficking. They just hadn't been looking at them through that lens. Now we know there's likely a lot more trafficking and a lot less prostitution going on than is readily apparent. And that has also made me look at patients a little bit differently as well, which may for you. It's widely believed that the most prevalent form of sex trafficking in the US is the sex trafficking of children. You may see a number of different terms used, but they all have somewhat similar meanings. Exploitation, or more specifically, sex trafficking of minors. What exactly is child sex trafficking? It's basically a seller making money by selling a product to a buyer, except the product in this case is a human being, usually a US citizen, who is underage. What qualifies as commercial sex? Commercial sex is anything of a sexual nature where someone is receiving money or something of value. And that can be food, rent, shelter, or even drugs. The activity itself may involve making pornographic images or online videos or stripping at a club or an actual sex act. But in fact, when a minor is involved in commercial sex, that buyer is also legally guilty of human trafficking. In fact, think about it this way. If they're paying to have sex with a minor, they're actually paying to rape a child. It's also trafficking. Speaking of buyers, sex trafficking would not exist if there were no demand. So who's buying and using these services? I really like to think it's the creepy guy who lives in the beat up trailer on the edge of town. It'll break your heart, but it's more likely to be closer to home. It's more likely to be our neighbors, our peers, possibly the person sitting next to me in church. All of these are examples of professions who have paid to exploit or even rape a minor. In fact, in late 23, a San Antonio emergency physician who happened to also be the regional VP for his practice group, was charged with solicitation of a minor, not trafficking, but solicitation of a minor. And he showed up at her school with the intent to meet up with her for sex. He was 46 years old. Child prostitution is an oxymoron. This is another phrase that needs to go away. If a minor cannot legally consent to sex, they cannot consent to prostitution. Thus, the exception for minors in federal trafficking law. Just as with labor trafficking, in the case of sex trafficking, the border is almost irrelevant. But unlike labor trafficking, far more sex trafficking victims are actually U.S. citizens as opposed to foreign-born. And it's just as big a problem in Kansas or Kentucky or any other state as it is Texas. The border is just not a big factor. Now, do people get smuggled across the border and then get sex trafficked? Occasionally, and it's definitely a risk for unaccompanied minors. But it still pales in comparison to the primary problem. So if we focus on the border, we actually miss the bigger issue. It's primarily our young people, our kids, that are the issue. Let's talk about traffickers and how human trafficking actually happens. I want to address another common misconception here, and this is specific to sex trafficking. A number of you probably saw the original movie Taken. I did because I'm a big fan of Liam Neeson's. If you didn't see it, in the original movie, Liam Neeson's teenage daughter gets kidnapped and then sex trafficked. The movie was well done and Liam did a great job, as he always does. But unfortunately, that was a way that a lot of the public, quote, learned about sex trafficking, and it's just not reality. It's very rare in the US. When kidnapping occurs in the United States, it's usually a non-custodial parent taking a child. In the unusual case, when kidnapping occurs for exploitation, it's almost always for that one person's abuse or exploitation, as opposed to renting them to third parties. So sex trafficking is not about the creepy guy in the white panel van snatching kids out of a parking lot or a school playground. It's just not how they work. Now, do predators do that? Yes. Traffickers? No. Why? Because it's a terrible business model. Traffickers are all about the money. So why would they take the risk when it's not only much easier, but it is far more lucrative to lure someone online, create a relationship so the victim goes with their exploiter willingly? So when you think about it, that white panel van is actually already inside your home on their cell phone or their laptop, their tablets. It is said when we give our children access to the internet, we give them access to the world. Yeah, and it also gives the world access to your child. But this is why educating kids against stranger danger is not effective for sex trafficking prevention. You're going to hear me use the term NCMEC. That's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Amber Alert people. NCMEC estimates that about 90% of all children who go missing go with their exploiter willingly because they know them or think they know them. So traffickers may target young people any place where they hang out. It may be school, sporting events, theater, or mall, but the most common place is still online because it's just gotten so easy. What do traffickers look like? I want you to get a picture in your head, and then I'm going to show you some pictures of actual traffickers, and you're going to be familiar with some of these. In fact, I don't think this couple needs any introduction. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. As you probably remember, Epstein died in prison while awaiting trial on human trafficking charges. But Maxwell, she was found guilty of sex trafficking and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And the judge described her case as horrific, having caused incalculable harm to her victims. Her victims. And I love that he appreciated that it was not just his victims, they were her victims as well. Keith Raniere ran what he called a self-improvement group called NXIVM, and he was convicted in 2019 of trafficking. But I found the people who worked with him more interesting. Some of you may recognize Allison Mack. She was a popular actress at one time, and she was not convicted of trafficking, but admitted to procuring young women for Mr. Raniere to exploit. And Claire Bronfman, she's heiress to the Seagram's fortune, the alcohol Seagram's. She literally was heiress to that fortune. She was convicted of lesser charges, but she was helping finance the whole organization. I think you know this guy. In September of 24, a lot of news about Sean Combs, or P. Diddy, because he was charged with sex trafficking, among other things. He was acquitted of the sex trafficking charges, which just shows how difficult it can be to prosecute and prove these cases. R. Kelly, though, was convicted of sex trafficking and sentenced to 30 years in prison. More of his victims were minors. You may or may not have heard about the former CEO of Abercrombie and Fitch. He was arrested in the fall of 24, along with 2 of his associates, for sex trafficking. This one hits a little closer to home just because of his profession. Alan Lee was a 26-year-old physician. He was arrested for attempted sex trafficking. He stated online that he wanted to rent minors for sex, and I quote, preferably 8 to 15 years old. Think about the 8-year-olds that you know. Now, you may not know these traffickers, but they're all Texas cases from our backyard. If you had lived in San Antonio for quite some time, you probably would recognize Mark Benavides. He was a prominent attorney in town for years, even ran for judge at one point, very well connected. But in 2018, he was convicted on multiple accounts of trafficking and sentenced to 80 years. Wow. Who was he trafficking? What got him 80 years? Some of his clients who couldn't pay. Oh, you can't pay? No problem. I got a deal for you on the side. This high school teacher and her son were charged with recruiting students for prostitution. Remember, minors cannot legally consent to commercial sex, so it's automatically trafficking. This couple ran a restaurant in Waco, and along with 2 other individuals, they were using their Chinese connections to bring workers in from China and then forcing them to work for no pay. These were 3 men in the Odessa area that were caught in a motel room with a 14-year-old female. They ended up being charged with sexual exploitation, but were caught during a human trafficking investigation. Lastly, I want you to meet the former Businesswoman of the Year for the Greater Austin Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Yep. Adriana Rodriguez ran a bilingual school in the Austin area, and she promised all her workers, her foreign-born employees, that she'd get them legal status, they'd have great pay and a fantastic career, and none of it happened. She's been under investigation for some time for labor trafficking in the state of Texas. These are great examples of just how diverse perpetrators can be. You have a prominent attorney, a teacher, an actress, an heiress, a CEO. Wealthy, influential people are just the neighbors next door. So I can't tell you what traffickers or even people who associate with traffickers look like. They were all somebody's next door neighbors. How do traffickers work? In short, they target people's needs or wants, and these may be physical needs, but often it's just psychological or emotional needs and desires. Most of us learned about Maslow in school, our hierarchy of needs, and I know Maslow has been debated, but the core concepts are still true. Our very basic needs are physiologic. We also feel the need to be safe, and we all want to belong and feel loved. And traffickers are usually very practiced at identifying a person's vulnerable areas and targeting those areas, generally near the bottom of that pyramid. I mentioned the lure for labor trafficking is usually physical needs. They need a job or they need a living wage to feed their family. Sometimes they're seeking shelter or safety, sometimes just a better life. Various techniques may be used, such as online ads, word of mouth, labor recruiters who aren't really, or just false promises. Remember the medical professionals I just mentioned. Those medical professionals lure their forced labor victims with the promise of a legal pathway to America. Whether it's online or in person, grooming often plays an important component in child sex trafficking especially. And when it comes to the trafficking of children, grooming is usually a very methodical process, and traffickers are usually very good at it. Initially, the trafficker will target vulnerabilities, as we talked about earlier. This may be someone with a true need or just someone looking for romance or adventure or attention. The trafficker will then try to gain their trust through casual conversations, promises of friendship or romance, and victims may respond to someone who they think understands them or gets them or just listens to them. The trafficker will then determine what it is that potential victim wants or needs the most, and they provide it. Is it nice gifts? Is it romance, adventure? Is it escape from a bad environment? Is it that new game on the market or that new cool pair of shoes that everybody wants? As the trafficker cultivates that relationship of trust, feeling the potential's victim's wants and needs, they will slowly start isolating the victim. And after successfully isolating the victim, abuse is typically not introduced till this point because by now it's tolerated. By now the victim thinks this is their romantic partner or their friend, or they just don't see a way out. And when it gets to this point, the trafficker has complete control. Note that there is a very strong similarity between this process for child sex trafficking and other grooming of minors for other types of sexual abuse. There is a lot of overlap for those two. Between lures and grooming, this is why education of our young people and ourselves really is critical. If we arm them with knowledge, it will help them avoid being a target and even a victim. Well, how does technology factor into human trafficking? Everything I've just talked about has been made a lot easier by tech, and traffickers typically are experts at exploiting tech. With online ads, labor trafficking victims get lured with promises of work, great pay, a better life, a legal pathway to the US. Sex trafficking victims may get lured with false flattery, romance, promises of money, fame, travel, adventure, escape, or even just attention. For someone who hasn't been the talk of the town, this can be especially appealing, especially for kids. Think about the kid who is bullied at school or doesn't fit in, or is new to town or new to the school. For sex trafficking, technology also helps distance the buyers and the traffickers from the criminal activity. While social media certainly can be used to entice labor trafficking targets with offers of employment and such, it is especially effective for the sex trafficking of children because these days, so many kids are documenting their lives online. And it's pretty easy for exploiters to follow their target online, figure out what is it they want, what's important to them, what are they looking for, and then they're going to start the process. Social media also can be used to control victims through threats of exposure and other types of coercion. There's another common misconception in sexual exploitation and sex trafficking that it happens primarily to females, and this is not the case. Multiple sources in recent years have indicated the exploitation of boys is likely underestimated significantly. In fact, one of our local experts is a federal agent who we work with, and he has dedicated his decades-long career to investigations of sexual exploitations. We're fortunate he assists our county sheriff's office as a Fed. And he says for years, and I asked him again recently, ratio of boys to girls in his investigations is about 50-50. Now with girls, traffickers tend to be more likely to use the grooming process. With boys, it's gaming apps with messaging features. They are the most popular routes for boys who are targeted for either trafficking or other sexual exploitation. However, boys can be groomed, and we're seeing more girls involved in gaming, and the predator will often pose as a peer and befriend the minor. This often develops into what we call sextortion. It's another predatory tool that has evolved from technology, and it plays a significant role in the exploitation of minors and young adults. Young people often share sexually oriented images without really thinking about the consequences. In fact, according to the FBI, there has been an explosion of sextortion cases targeting young people in the US just in the last few years. I'm going to play you a short video that I think will give you a quick overview of the problem.
FBI field offices across the country have reported an increase in youth sextortion cases where sexually explicit content is used as blackmail. Stephanie Sy reports on the concerning trend and preventive efforts to protect minors.
Social media has become fertile ground for scammers to target young people, and in some cases, the consequences have been deadly. In a 2-year period between October 2021 to March 2023, the FBI received over 13,000 reports of online financial sextortion of minors. It impacted 12,600 victims and led to at least 20 suicides. FBI Special Agent Emily Steele joins us from the Phoenix field office with more on what the dangers of sextortion are and what parents can do to prevent it. Agent Steele, thank you so much for joining the NewsHour. First of all, give me a sense of how prevalent this crime has become and why the FBI is especially concerned about young people.
This crime has become significantly more prevalent, especially with younger children's access to technology. So whether it be receiving an iPad or a Chromebook from school that has internet connection, or even just availability of getting on a parent's phone and using social media, kids are learning younger and younger how to navigate through the internet and online social media world, and that's creating more victims for predators.
Okay, so this is happening, I understand, through social media. How exactly are these people luring children in through these platforms? How does it work?
You know, it can be described in a long or short process, but the short process is children are vulnerable and children are everywhere online and not using proper security techniques on their social media. So say, for instance, they have an Instagram, it's not set to private and anyone can follow them and see what they're doing on their day-to-day activity. So if a child posts on their Instagram story, for instance, that they're in school and they're taking pictures with their friends, well, then a predator instantly knows that this is a minor because they are in school. From there, it can be as easy as sending a direct message and complimenting the minor or pretending to be a minor from the opposite sex and asking for nude photos. And unfortunately, it happens very quickly. It's not a long process or a long drawn out relationship. It can happen in a matter of minutes that they are convincing these children to send nude or explicit photos and videos of themselves.
As the agent indicated, the consequences can be dire. Boys and young men tend to be particularly susceptible due to the shame and their reluctance to tell anyone. And a number of them sadly have taken their own lives after being sextorted online. We used to tell kids that once their image was out there, there was no hope of getting it back. But now there is hope. NCMEC actually has a Take It Down program that can help remove online explicit images and videos if they were taken before the age of 18. So educate the kids in your life. This is very different than the federal Take It Down Act that was passed into law in May of 25. This law now makes it illegal to knowingly publish or even threaten to publish intimate images without a person's consent, and that includes AI-generated or deep fake material. It also will require websites and social media companies to remove such material within 48 hours of notice from a victim. We're all very curious to see how that's going to play out. Texas has passed several laws related or tangential to human trafficking in the most recent legislative sessions. I'm just going to tell you about just a few. First of all, soliciting prostitute is now a state jail felony in the state of Texas. As I stated previously, what looks like prostitution may actually be trafficking, and this is our attempt to catch more of these individuals. I mentioned that grooming is a common component in sexual exploitation of minors. That is now a third-degree felony. The law has been challenged in court, so we'll see how it plays out, but it's a great start. This is important also from a medical perspective. We'll address this later, but strangulation during the commission of interpersonal violence now enhances the penalties of that crime. And recent studies have shown us that a significant percentage of sex trafficking victims are strangled or asphyxiated during their abuse. So where do we come in? Where's our role as healthcare providers? First, I want you to be aware that you may be interacting with trafficking victims right now. This is a study from 2014 that is still often quoted. In this study, 88% of the victims and survivors surveyed said that they had seen a healthcare provider while they were being trafficked and were not identified as potential victims. It was a valid study, but it was small, only 98 individuals, and it only surveyed adult, female, sex trafficking victims. It did not address children or labor trafficking or males. As I mentioned earlier, trafficking statistics can be slippery. There's a lot of variability. The important takeaway is just to be aware that these victims may be present in more practice settings than you might initially consider. Schools, not just the classroom, on the athletic field, the nurse's office, dental offices, clinics, physician offices, urgent care and emergency centers, shelters, residential treatment centers, all types of clinical therapy settings. I could go on, but you get the idea. But why are we as healthcare providers in a position to intervene? You may not be aware, but for over 2 decades now, healthcare professionals have consistently been ranked as the most trusted professions in the United States. People still trust us. You know what human trafficking is, that it's a problem in our backyard and that victims often intersect with us as healthcare providers. The next logical question would be, well, how would I know if I encounter a victim? That is what I'm going to address next, identifying victims. But before we discuss indicators or red flags, let's get rid of our stereotypes. Victims are not just young people. Do not forget to consider labor trafficking, which can occur at almost any age except for the age extremes. And again, both males and females are sex and labor trafficked. Victims are not just immigrants and foreigners. In fact, sex trafficking victims are much more likely to be U.S. citizens. And it's not just the poor or abused or disadvantaged. While they are often more vulnerable, all socioeconomic groups are affected, especially for sex trafficking. At our organization, we focus on sex trafficking and exploitation of minors. And we have provided services to individuals in every part of the metro area, in every zip code, every socioeconomic strata. Some kids are from vulnerable situations, but we sometimes see victims from healthy families who are good in school, even active in church, but they've been lured online. Well, knowing that, if you interact with patients and clients, just know that you will likely interact with victims and survivors. Well, what do they look like? Think about it somewhat along the line as universal precautions. We're all taught to treat bodily fluids potentially infectious, no matter who it is, right? Kind of in that same way, I want you to consider the possibility that any of your patients may be a victim. Consider any man, any woman, every boy, every girl that you interact with a possibility, because we don't know what they're going to look like. Well, knowing that, what should you look for? Indicators for human trafficking can also be difficult to cover because they don't fit into nice, neat, discrete little categories by themselves. There is crossover between indicators for trafficking and other possible causes. What I'm going to ask of you is a simple exercise. As I go through these red flags and indicators, I'd like you to make note of certainly any that you weren't aware of or wouldn't have thought about, but especially note any indicators that would make you personally suspect trafficking is a possibility if you saw it in your practice setting. Some indicators are going to be easier to spot, and some of the things we're going to talk about are going to be easier to see if you're performing a physical exam, if that's part of your role. And I know that's not all of us, but most red flags will typically fall into one of these ABCs: their appearance, their behavior, or communication. And really, even if it's not trafficking, if your spidey sense is telling you something is not right, typically someone needs help. What I'm simply asking is that you keep trafficking in your differential. Their appearance. These findings are all too familiar to some of us. Typical signs and symptoms of neglect and abuse, wounds in various stages, unexplained injuries. Then victims are often trained to tell lies or even scripted stories to avoid detection. My background is in trauma. I have found if the story doesn't match the clinical picture, 3 common possibilities are things that I need to look at. Is there some kind of abuse involved? And that can be physical or emotional abuse, including sexual abuse. Is substance abuse involved, or is there some other criminal activity going on? Those are just things that I consider if things aren't marrying up. In addition, any untreated medical issues, whether it be acute or chronic, or indications of delayed medical treatment. Neglected medical issues can be signs of control by another party, but that can also happen with poverty or someone with mental health challenges, which can confound the picture. Just be alert, be a little bit suspicious. Maybe they appear malnourished or in poor health. That's another sign. You may see acute or chronic findings, signs of trauma, maybe old or new, or a mix of old and new, which I certainly would be suspect of. Poor dental health or oral or dental injuries may be evident if you look. Now, I'm not suggesting you do a dental exam on all your patients. Just be observant, be aware. GI issues may be chronic or acute. In the medical setting, headache is oftentimes a chief complaint that will bring them in the door. Don't automatically write off a headache if you see other suspicious indicators. Abdominal pain is another common chief complaint. Their behavior. Are they a poor historian? Are they avoiding eye contact? Do they have a flat affect or appear depressed? Do they seem withdrawn or fearful? Or maybe you see hypervigilance or subordination. I mentioned earlier that traffickers will often retain ID as a form of control, especially if it's a passport or visa, and that alone can create fear and an unwillingness to engage. Perhaps they're unable to provide a residential address to the front desk. Oh, I'm just visiting, or I'm just passing through. That happened actually just last week with a colleague that I knew, and she suspected something was going on because they couldn't provide an address. Did some investigation and found out certainly there was some other criminal activity going on. Victims, believe it or not, may not even know what town they're in. Now, I mentioned that you don't have to be transported to be trafficked, and you don't. But some victims are taken on what is, both labor and sex trafficking victims are taken on what is called the circuit, where they're routinely taken to different places to work. For instance, labor trafficking victims in agriculture may have to follow different harvest seasons. Sex trafficking victims may be forced to follow major events. But again, many victims just may not even be aware that they themselves are victims. Communication. Be especially mindful of nonverbal cues with people. You have to really, really pay attention with these individuals. And again, if you don't know ahead of time, just be attentive to any nonverbal signals that they're sending. Is the patient especially submissive to the person with them? And this may be a controlling or domineering adult who is older than they are, but it also can be somebody closer in age who they claim is their, oh, my sister or my cousin or my brother-in-law. That person is sometimes the trafficker, but far more common, it is just somebody working with or for the trafficker, or even another victim who has also been threatened. We've all seen patients or clients with controlling partners or family members where the other person tries to control the conversation and doesn't allow the patient to speak for themselves. Well, as good clinicians, we always encourage that patient to respond for themselves. But when they do, note their response and how they respond. Do they seem nervous? Do they keep glancing at the other person as though they're trying to say the right thing or stick to the script? Just keep an eye on that. Maybe you see inappropriate contact between the patient and the person with them. Maybe that extra strong grip on the shoulder, or maybe something that you feel even has a little bit of an odd connotation that you just think is not right. Pick up on those things. Social media has actually made this a universal hand signal for I need help. Open palm, thumb inside, fingers down, and they're probably going to try to hide it from the person with them. So if you see somebody trying to make that sign, they're trying to communicate with you, I need help. These indicators are more specific to labor trafficking. Do you happen to discover that they live where they work? Well, if they don't own the business, that could be a red flag. Now, as practitioners, we typically don't know whether someone has their ID, but your front desk personnel need to be alert that this is a potential red flag and relay that information to you as the provider. Is there a language barrier? Do you find out that they've recently arrived in the US? Those are all indicators. Victims may be fearful of authorities like law enforcement, and this certainly can be true of sex trafficking when a victim wants help, but they fear being found out and the repercussions that go with that. Labor trafficking victims typically have a greater fear of deportation, especially if the trafficker has confiscated their documents or if they're undocumented, but also perhaps they fear losing their only source of income, no matter how brutal the conditions, especially if they're trying to feed children. Think about what you wouldn't do for your kids. You may see signs of dehydration, exhaustion, or untreated injuries that you suspect could be work-related. Or perhaps they have an injury that could reflect unsafe or even dangerous working conditions. When you're assessing your patient, consider the possibility of environmental exposures, even if they don't report that it's work-related. For instance, what would you expect to see if they're working, let's say, in an enclosed space with inadequate ventilation and there's toxic chemicals and they have no PPE? Or what if your patient or even a family member with them has signs of excessive sun exposure and it's obvious they have chronic musculoskeletal problems, maybe even respiratory issues? Those may reflect unsafe conditions in an agricultural setting. In a minor, consider signs that they may be in a work setting for which they're too young. Injuries in a child may indicate abuse, but they also may be signs of child labor. Even if it's not labor trafficking, it still could be other types of exploitation. More specific to sex trafficking, if we're not considering exploitation in our differential, it is very easy to misinterpret certain signs. For instance, it can be easy to just categorize these patients as, oh, hookers or frequent flyers or users. I have certainly been guilty of that in my career, and I wish I knew then what I knew today. Is their attire or behavior overly sexual for their age? Well, if so, it's easy to write that off to promiscuity. Or do they look younger than their stated age? Or there's inappropriate clothing for the weather. It is 110 outside and they're all covered up, or it's freezing and they barely have anything on. Now, some of you who are parents of teenagers are probably thinking, hey, that's being a teenager. And sometimes it is, but it also could be exploitation. So just consider that in your differential. Maybe they come across overly confident or even brash as a protective mechanism. Well, if I'm not thinking beyond that, I may interpret that as, oh, that one's just got an attitude. Tattoos can be a key red flag. They may be obvious, they may be hidden. But common signs of ownership in a tattoo are the word daddy or a crown, money symbols or other symbols of power. These are common signs of ownership. Does the person have more than one phone? Or do they seem nervous or fearful when they can't immediately answer a text or a phone call? That would make me suspicious. Sex traffickers will often use drugs as a means of coercion, control, and manipulation, even if the victim was not on drugs initially. Have they had multiple sexually transmitted infections, abortion at an early age, or just multiple unwanted pregnancies? Maybe they've had multiple visits for GYN problems. Again, it can be very easy to write that off to prostitution or promiscuity. Even if it's not trafficking, it could be other exploitation. I mentioned earlier that studies have shown that strangulation and asphyxiation are often associated with sex trafficking. Look at their neck. Be observant. Do you see petechial hemorrhage? Do you see other signs of trauma? I've already mentioned the possibility of dental trauma. With any clinical sign or symptom, it's easy to write off one particular clinical finding. Sometimes it requires putting them all together to see the pattern. And keep in mind, if you're working in a setting where you see repetitive visits from the same person, these indicators may not become apparent until the third or the fourth or the 10th visit, sometimes even months later. Now, I know I've covered a lot of information, and there certainly are a lot of indicators to cover, but sometimes there are none. This was a young lady who was discovered during the UT study, and she said to the public, nothing was wrong with me. I was very active in school, in sports, even in theater. And her traffickers made her continue all those activities, but they controlled her phone and her social media so that it would appear that nothing in her life had changed. People who are being trafficked are not always missing. Some of them go home every day. And of course, this is especially true with familial trafficking. The possible long-term consequences of trafficking are numerous, and time prevents us from covering these in depth. I'm going to cover just a few. First, you have the physical consequences, the effects of chronic, repetitive, or untreated disease, illness, or injuries. And for anyone who experiences repetitive trauma, they keep releasing cortisol. Persistent cortisol release can lead to a host of problems. First of all, it suppresses serotonin. Serotonin is one of our feel-good neurotransmitters. If it keeps getting suppressed, you're more likely to have a patient who's anxious or agitated. Persistent cortisol release also affects metabolism and glucose control. Think about your diabetics. It suppresses the immune system. It affects digestion. It makes GI issues more likely. Over time, it can even become toxic to certain brain cells. The hippocampus is particularly susceptible because of its role in cortisol function. I mentioned that sleep deprivation is a common means of control for victims. Well, guess what? Sleep deprivation further increases cortisol production. They don't get 3 square meals a day. Lack of nutrition is going to make them more susceptible to illness, less likely to heal. And for sex trafficking victims, sexual dysfunction can be common in this population, and sometimes they'll have irreparable reproductive damage. In addition to long-term physical problems, which we've just touched on, victims will often develop cognition and learning barriers and even executive function impairment. And this is especially true when trauma occurs to the developing brain. Remember, executive functions live up here in our prefrontal cortex, which is the last part of the brain to fully develop around the age of 25, which, yes, I know explains a lot. But remember that executive functions control things like judgment, rational thought, emotional regulation, communication, all the things we expect our patients to be able to access when they're engaging with us as healthcare providers. Well, these functions may have been hijacked if trauma has occurred to the developing brain. Also, self-medication is common in this population, and there are multiple effects on mental health. In fact, poor mental health is not only a dominant, but a persistent adverse health effect associated with human trafficking. Depression is very common in this population. PTSD is fairly prevalent, as well as eating and anxiety disorders and plenty of other things. Another long-term mental health consequence can be trauma bonding, which is a psychological bond with their exploiter. More on that in just a moment. You know human trafficking is a problem. Hopefully you have a few more clues on how to identify it. But now what do you do with that information? Before we talk about specific interventions, we need to address barriers. This is important. Recognize your own potential barriers because we all have them. Everything I'm going to show you right here on this slide are suggestions from survivors because these are all things they have encountered in healthcare settings. One of the biggest barriers I've encountered is people believing it won't happen in their practice setting. In fact, I fell prey to this thinking the very first time I gave this talk was to a group of physical therapists. And I'm thinking, yeah, if they're being trafficked, are they going to be going to physical therapy? I got a call the following day from the owner, and she said, I want to let you know that that training was very timely because we identified a victim in our practice today. Boy, was I humbled. I felt like I got schooled and I needed to listen to my own advice. I've had people who worked in faith-based environments or affluent schools and say, I know we have to have this training, but it's really not relevant for me. Yeah, it is. Victims have been identified in those settings. So in addition to that, we've already talked about resisting stereotypes. And again, these are suggestions from survivors. Watch your affect and your body language. These are things they have encountered. Regardless of your role or how busy you are, and I know for some of us, we maybe have 2 minutes to establish a relationship of trust and cooperation. It doesn't take any extra time to smile, to look your patient in the eye, and just be kind. In fact, with these individuals, I cannot overstate the importance of simple kindness. They get so little. Avoid a judgmental approach. I don't think any of us do this intentionally. But I'll speak for myself. I know in the trauma world, I can get in the zone when I'm really busy and I may come across abrupt or short, and I need to be careful about that. Remember that survey of trafficking survivors I mentioned earlier where 88% of them said, yeah, we saw a healthcare provider, but nobody even identified as a potential victims. Well, the surveyor said, so why didn't you disclose? Why didn't you say something? The biggest barrier that they identified was feeling judged by the healthcare provider. Think about the way sometimes we talk about the frequent flyer or the user or the delinquent or the hooker. Everyone has a story. Whether we know their story or not, they all have one. I want you to think about personal experience. Let's say at a store or a restaurant that you went to and you were treated poorly and you said, I'm not going back there again, and you didn't. That was likely because of poor customer service. Now think about an issue this personal and this sensitive. If you felt judged or disrespected or just a lack of compassion, why would you ever go back? Well, you wouldn't. We must create a safe environment for them. Remember, with Maslow's safety is right after physiological needs. Now, I know we're supposed to screen for everything, but again, it doesn't take any extra time to be observant, to be aware, and to act kindly. Now, it's not always easy to identify victims because they have barriers as well. First, as I mentioned earlier, many don't even recognize that they are victims. And it's not uncommon for many of them to have been mislabeled as criminals instead of victims. And if that's happened, they're not likely to trust authority of any kind. Many victims also feel like the situation is their fault or they're very ashamed. And this is common with the younger survivors that we deal with. Some have resigned themselves to this life as their only option. They already feel helpless. They don't have any way out. Some have been told, hey, this is what you're really good at. Many don't feel like they deserve anything better by this point. And then there's trauma bonding. When there's ongoing control or abuse within a relationship, a trauma bond can form. When there's an uneven power dynamic and the victim is either physically or more often psychologically unable to escape, they have to develop a way to survive. And this explains why victims will often develop feelings of trust or even affection for an abuser. For us, it's important to understand it is a survival strategy for them. A number of you probably heard the term Stockholm Syndrome. This is where it came from. Decades ago in Stockholm, Sweden, hostages in a bank robbery were detained for several days. And during those few days, Some of the hostages bonded with their captors enough that they not only refused to testify against them, some defended them in court. Now think about that. A trauma bond occurred within a matter of days with hostages, people who were basically kidnapped by strangers in a hostile situation. Now consider that many of the traumatized victims that we're talking about start out believing their abuser or exploiter is someone they love or trust, a romantic partner or friend, or even a parent. So it's not a big leap to see how they might stay loyal to their abusers. We all want to be treated kindly. And if that is in short supply, the victim's going to hang on to whatever little kindness they can get. However small the kindness, some is better than none. We all want to be loved. For sex trafficking victims, sometimes breaking free of that trauma bond means letting go of the fantasy of being loved, and that's really tough. Traffickers typically are very good at the deliberate development of these trauma bonds. They will alternate small acts of caring and kindness with lots of threats and abuse, and that keeps that bond intact. Beyond recognizing barriers, what is our role as healthcare providers in this situation? Well, it depends obviously on your role or your position at your organization. It should go without saying that interventions with potential victims and survivors should always be patient-centered, trauma-informed, and evidence-based. So what should you do? Well, before you can answer that question, try to find out the answer to these questions. Does your organization have something in place? A protocol, a policy, a guideline? Is there a screening tool available with training to use it? Do you know how to access sexual assault nurse examiners or perhaps a race crisis center when needed? Well, you may have some or you may have none of those resources. What is critical is that you establish trust and rapport. Now, if you do have a protocol, the answer is straightforward. Follow it, use the resources you have. But many of you will not have that. That might be a starting point for you or someone in your department or your organization. And don't be overwhelmed by that task. It can be something as simple as, these are the indicators we're looking for. This is what we do in response. And these are our community resources. It can be that simple. It does not have to be something formal to give you some guidance. Always use a trauma-informed approach. Now, I've used that term a couple of times now, but what does it actually mean? Trauma-informed care is not just the latest buzz phrase in patient care. It is a victim-centered approach that is evidence-based practice for working with trauma victims and survivors. It does make a difference. With trauma-informed care, the primary guiding principle is safety. Above all, the goal is to avoid re-traumatization, and that includes not blaming or criminalizing the victim. This short video will help explain a little bit about trauma-informed care.
When you are vulnerable, it really shows up in your body and your health. And human trafficking victims are definitively some of the most vulnerable people in our community and some of the most vulnerable people that we are going to treat in the healthcare system. My name is Julie Maxon. I'm a social worker and manager of our care coordination department. At least half of trafficked individuals come into contact with the healthcare industry at some point during their trafficking experience. And we hear from survivors repeatedly that in their contacts with the healthcare system, they did not disclose that they were being trafficked, even when asked by someone that they trusted and knew was there to care for them. They will adamantly deny it and deny it as though their life depends on it. And it does. If we can help our providers all understand that those are also signs and symptoms of being in a trafficked situation, we can understand that a lot of these walls that are being put up are in fact just extremely important defense mechanisms. We can then partner with them and align with them and let them know that we're actually on their side. Maybe they might want to know about this hotline, or they might want to know about this resource, maybe for themselves, maybe for someone they know. Maybe if they change their mind down the road. That is a huge step forward in putting information into their hands that they can then use to possibly leave their situation. As healthcare workers, the best thing we can do for victims of human trafficking is to provide trauma-informed care to all of our patients and to act as if every patient we see has experienced some form of trauma.
Dignity Health has done a lot of work in this field. They have a survivor advocate working with them. Again, regardless of how many or how few resources you have, as any healthcare provider, we should always be looking for red flags. But when we encounter indicators or symptoms that the patient communicates, document, document, document. That actually is your best legal tool to assist the victim. Some people are concerned that once they've had this training that they're going to be expected to interview victims. No, absolutely not. Unless you have had specific training, leave the investigative work to the appropriate agencies or personnel. You certainly can ask appropriate clinical questions, but you should never probe for the details of their trauma. That actually can cause re-traumatization. What you can do, though, is use a survivor-informed approach. And again, these are all suggestions from survivors. I'm not suggesting you have to use these specific statements, but when it is appropriate, attempt to communicate the sentiment. One survivor told me this, and it really stuck with me recently. She said, "I cannot overstate the importance of humility in the healthcare setting." That really resonated with me. Listen to them. Are you just looking at your chart? Are you just focusing on that digital screen in front of you? Don't just look at your patient, really see them, look them in the eye, maybe take the extra couple of seconds to sit down and get on eye level and listen to what they're saying and what they're not saying. Let them know they matter. Now, word of caution, communicating with victims is not always easy. As a result of what they're going through or what they've been through, sometimes it can be difficult to communicate with them. And sometimes their coping mechanisms, which typically aren't healthy, may make them not real pleasant to deal with. All I ask is you try not to let that discourage you. Allow them to communicate in their language and their vocabulary with as little or as much as they want to share. And again, do not probe. And also, for instance, don't try to correct them if they keep referring to someone who is clearly exploiting them or trafficking them. If they keep calling them their boyfriend, just let them speak. You can find all these terms online. I've listed the Shared Hope website on this slide, but there are other sources too. If you learn some of these basic terms ahead of time that might be familiar to victims, it's easier to accept and document how they share the situation in their words, which is important. Now, of utmost importance is trying to assure the patient feels safe. You need to safely separate them from the person with them. Obviously, don't do anything that you feel could put you at risk. And there are going to be different approaches appropriate for different settings. These suggestions are for a medical setting, such as a physician's office, clinic, or emergency department. Give the person with them a task to do, or I need you to go fill out a form at the front, whether you do or not. Tell them you need to take the patient with you to get a urine sample or to radiology for an x-ray, whether you need that or not. Be creative. Ideally, you should designate patient-only bathrooms because it makes it a whole lot easier to provide private patient conversations. You don't always have that option, but I know some clinics and physicians' offices will use colored dots in the bathrooms, and they may have a sign that says, if you need help, put a green dot on your urine sample, or tear off one of these red tabs and hand it to a staff member if you need help. There are now several screening tools for human trafficking, and these are just 3 that have been validated. But the challenge with many screening tools is they can take quite some time to administer, and some apply only to specific populations of patients or even specific types of screeners or settings like law enforcement or social services or healthcare. The See It tool is probably the most well-known and the most commonly used tool for sex trafficking, but it is somewhat lengthy and it only addresses sex trafficking. The RAF tool is a more recently validated tool that is much shorter, and it's a lot easier to use in what I call limited interaction settings like clinic or emergency departments. I am not going to go into more detail on specific tools because they're going to be organization-based and role-based, and none should be utilized without training. But intervention-based tools are different. These tools provide guidance on how to interact with patients and clients rather than identifying whether there's an issue. So anyone can use intervention-based tools. These are two that are evidence-based tools. They're very similar. The one on the right was developed by a survivor, the PAIR tool. Provide a safe private space. We've kind of talked about how to do that, being creative with privately, giving them some private space. Use non-judgmental education. What do I mean by that? Instead of potentially making them feel singled out, like you need to know about XYZ, that can create fear. Say something along the lines of, you know, I educate all my patients on XYZ, and that's a lot less threatening. Try to allow time for them to ask questions or have discussions. And some of us are going to have very brief interactions with patients, and extended conversations may not be possible, but regardless, respect their response. If the patient declines to engage, respect that. Now, it's okay to ask. In fact, I would encourage you to ask, is there anything else you'd like to share? But do not push and do not probe. That is part of empowering them. Keep in mind, disclosure is not the goal. Interpreters. It is just so tempting to use the family member or the person with them, but you just can't. In the hospital setting, hospitals are required to have access to professional interpreters, but outside the hospital, maybe it is simply an assigned staff member who's trained in confidentiality and comfortable with sensitive topics. Know your protocol. When communicating through an interpreter, always use best practices. Speak more slowly in shorter segments. Make sure you keep eye contact with the patient, not the interpreter. And make sure the interpreter knows to alert you to any cultural misunderstandings or questions or confusion. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about reporting. As healthcare professionals, of course, we're mandatory reporters by law. In fact, all citizens in the state of Texas are actually mandatory reporters, but professionals have additional guidelines. If you are reporting a case of suspected trafficking, obviously you're required to report to DFPS, Department of Family Protective Services, or CPS, for minors, as well as reporting to law enforcement. And note, the window for required reporting for us is now 24 hours. It used to be 48. Now it's 24. This is a new law passed in Texas. Use words that will convey the level of your concern. In other words, use the word trafficking if that is your suspicion. Your words can send the case to a specific task force or even a specific officer, and oftentimes will elevate or even expedite the case, especially if a minor is involved. Mandatory reporting is pretty clear for most of us. Reporting is needed as a little bit different. Reporting is mandatory if there's an outcry, if they clearly are asking for help, or if they're clearly describing a situation where force, fraud, or coercion are evident. Keep in mind, again, most victims will not outcry or even consider themselves a victim. It's not our job to try to convince them that they are. Do not try to convince them that they are a victim. When you contact law enforcement, request to speak with someone who works with trafficking cases. Other than emergency situations, it's best to use non-emergency law enforcement numbers for these types of calls. I keep the non-emergency numbers for my county sheriff and my local PD in my phone. But again, use the appropriate phrasing. I'm concerned my patient or client is being trafficked. Specify whether it's labor or sex, adult or minor, and share the reasons for your suspicions. You generally won't need to call 911 unless you're in a non-medical setting or you're outside of your work environment, or if you think someone is in immediate danger. I always tell someone, though, if in doubt, if you're not sure, call. I always tell clinicians, err on the side of your patient. 911 can always reroute you. If you do need to involve law enforcement, there are some implications to be aware of when law enforcement does get involved. First, victims are often told that, hey, law enforcement is just going to arrest you and lock you up. In fact, not only may they fear arrest, they may have already had that happen for things they were forced to do while being trafficked. This is what we call forced criminality. Perhaps they were arrested for drug use when the drugs were being forced on them. Perhaps they're being arrested for prostitution when in fact it's trafficking. Maybe they're arrested for being here illegally when they just don't have access to their legal documents. As we said, most forced labor victims actually are here legally and just have had their documents confiscated by bad actors. All victims are typically told, hey, no one's going to care. And then foreign-born victims, as I mentioned, may relate to police back home who are corrupt or violent. When law enforcement is involved, re-traumatization is always a risk. If you have law enforcement who are used to dealing with victims, they will understand that and hopefully have some training and more compassion. And this is why you ask for officers who are used to dealing with trafficking victims. Law enforcement is like any other profession. You're going to have some who are better trained and more receptive than others. If at all possible, you should also contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Why? It's a national database for receiving calls and logging suspected trafficking cases. The hotline staff, though, are specifically trained in what questions to ask and often will also provide relevant information to local law enforcement. The other thing they can do is they can track activity and connect dots across multiple jurisdictions when cases are similar, and that can be more difficult for law enforcement to even discover. There was a case between St. Louis, Missouri, was the same actors in San Antonio, Texas. Neither law enforcement jurisdiction would have known except for the hotline staff called and said, hey, this sounds a lot like the people who are operating in St. Louis, and sure enough, it was. If you are calling the hotline and do not have patient consent, you cannot disclose protected health information. But what you can do is call them with hypotheticals, request resources and guidance, and you can also share information about the person accompanying your patient, the expected exploiter or other victim, because they are not your patient, as long as doing so does not identify your patient. Texas was the first state that actually developed a formal partnership with the hotline, which has helped aid investigations. Victim resources are also available at the hotline. And in addition to the toll-free number, they have a text number, web chat, and email option. And I have the hotline phone number and text number in my contacts. I have used them, and not just at work. I have used them outside of work. When thinking about support services in the healthcare setting, consider, well, who might be part of the team? Who do you have access to? Are there social workers, licensed counselors, any staff that are trauma-informed? You do need a multidisciplinary team. For sex trafficking victims, do you have either a rape crisis center in the region who helps with these cases, or access to sexual assault nurse examiners? What about victim resources in your areas? Well, maybe you have no idea. There's no reason you would initially if you hadn't thought about it before. So talk to a licensed counselor, talk to a social worker or case manager, or talk to a local human trafficking nonprofit. If you're in the Houston area, there are several nonprofits that work with human trafficking cases that can provide you more information on resources. The other place you can go is the Human Trafficking Hotline actually has a referral directory with a zip code search. You can go online, type in your zip code, and it will bring up all the resources for human trafficking victims that it knows about in your area. Know how to make a referral for victim services when needed, and who in your organization or practice will make that referral. If you happen to be in the Bexar County area, we take referrals at our nonprofit. But if you make these decisions and develop these partnerships in advance, it will help expedite getting those victims the help that they need. Do that ahead of time. This is a guide developed by a survivor that I just love. It's designed specifically for healthcare interactions with suspected victims. Why don't we have more victims in the healthcare setting? Well, maybe we do, and we're not identifying them. First, believe them. There is a reason that survivors put this item first on the list. I cannot tell you how many survivors I have heard who finally worked up the courage to outcry to someone in healthcare, but they were not believed. In fact, it happened to a colleague of mine with her own daughter. She took her own daughter to her own place of employment, and they weren't taken seriously at all. And that's where she worked. She ended up going to a neighboring county and did get help where they took her seriously. And when law enforcement investigated, they were able to confirm that her daughter was indeed being trafficked. You may hear some crazy stories. Please don't automatically write them off. Provide resources only if they want help. Never put written information into their belongings without their permission. You actually could endanger them by doing that. Affirm them, empower them, be encouraging, give them a voice, listen without judgment. Allow them to make their own choices. That is in part of empowering them. But again, most victims will not outcry will not self-identify, and will not be willing to accept your help, at least initially. And that is okay, even though that's hard for us. I had a recent conversation with a prosecutor whose passion is prosecuting traffickers and other abuse cases. And she made this statement to me that really stuck with me. She said, nearly all my cases are the result of a medical professional creating the conditions for a victim to eventually report. I want you to let that sink in. Nearly all my cases are the result of a medical professional creating the conditions for a victim to eventually report. We can make a difference. All right, let's wrap things up. What is our role? It's to gain their trust and to help them feel safe. I keep emphasizing the word safe for a reason. Be observant, document well, and report when required. Well, isn't that just being a good clinician? Basically, that's it. Keep in mind, though, it's not our job to save the patient. It's our job to create a safe and a trusting environment. It's our job to involve law enforcement when it's appropriate, to provide victim-centered care, and to know what the community resources are. The rest of it is up to the patient. What is success in this scenario? I don't want anybody to feel like they have failed if they know something's wrong and that patient will not disclose. You have not failed. What is most important in this situation? Whether or not they're receptive to your interaction, it's that you've made them feel safe and welcome to return. And isn't that what we should be doing for most anyone? To put a point on it, success is not identification. Success is that people will have a positive experience in the healthcare setting and see it and us as a safe place to disclose if and when they are ready. This is a really tough subject, so I want you to know that there is hope. There are so many individuals who have not only managed to survive this horrific trauma, but have even found lives beyond it and a way to thrive. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, or you can contact me through our website. In fact, speaking of our website, I do want to give a shout out to our partner, Ransom Life of Texas and San Antonio. And if you are a parent or have minor children in your life and would like more information or how to educate yourselves or those kiddos, you can go to the Knowledge Hub on our homepage. You can find additional information there. And we also have some age-appropriate educational videos that are available free on demand for children and for adults. Now I'm going to allow time again. If you have questions, feel free to email me. Just know, and this is the man I'm going to quote, who helped end slavery in England. You may choose to look the other way, but you cannot ever say again that you did not know. I hope today that you were able not just to learn something, but more importantly, that you are able to implement what you have learned in your practice setting. Let's do our best to commit that none of these individuals will escape notice, but will meet nothing but compassion and kindness when they encounter us. Thank you all very much for attending.